I often report on the hundreds of politicians that I've caught breaking the law. I track their fines, $612,000 and growing, and I give you, my viewers, occasional updates on these stories. Now, mistakenly, I've actually presumed that people know the history or the backstory of why I do this and how I got started. But based on some questions that I've received lately, mostly in person and from new activists when I'm speaking in public or conducting training sessions, I realized that I've really never fully recorded the story about how I kind of went down this dark path and what caused me to engage so aggressively on these laws. I mean, what would cause someone to file over 650 complaints? And I've written about some of these issues in the past in little pieces here and there, but I've actually linked to some of the contemporaneous stories down below just in case you're interested. However, I never produced a video about it, and that changes now with this video. Now, I don't want to just go down memory lane with you. That is boring for you anyway. And no, I think this is worthwhile because there are real lessons that others can learn based on my experiences, both my successes and my failures. There's a lot of stories here that I think are useful and interesting. Also, I believe that if you understand what I did and how I got here on these issues, it might inspire you to find innovative and alternative approaches in your fight for liberty and freedom where you live as well. Now, this channel's only about 7 years old. I started it shortly after I no longer worked at the Freedom Foundation, and mostly I was training activists at the time on how to tell stories using videos like this. I never really intended to be a YouTube content producer, which is kind of funny, but it's true. At the time, I had already experienced the loss of a YouTube channel back in 2013 as an early example of political censorship caused mostly by litigation against me by kind of this crazy cult lady named Jay-Z Knight who dumped massive sums of cash into the Democratic Party in Washington State, and she was angry about my videos exposing her racist hate speech at the time. And I just wasn't producing many videos at the time when I started this channel. So in 2016, instead, I was just training activists working mostly on property rights issues in Washington State, and I was marginally engaged in a few local county commissioner races where I live in Thurston County, which is kind of home of Olympia's state capital in Olympia. So now the Democrats had controlled the county commission in Thurston County for decades, and I've been involved in a variety of mostly unsuccessful political efforts to remove them from office at the time. We had succeeded in one decent independent commissioner that was elected in 2014, and the final two were up for election in 2016. Now, Trump was on the ballot, and he got smoked in Thurston County with less than 36% of the vote. So this is a tough political environment if you're not politically left of center. However, the two independent candidates I supported for county commissioner that year, that's 2016 again, they ended up with 51% and 53% of the vote, shutting the Democrats out of the Thurston County Commission for the first time ever. And it was the first time since 1889, essentially statehood, that no county commissioner officially identified with either party was in office in Thurston County. So the Democrats were understandably furious and frustrated. And they were furious, of course, because I had this pathetic and marginally competent political action committee at the time with just a few $1,000s, and I'd launched some robocalls which annoyed the Democrats at the time. I mean, it really made them quite angry, actually, and it was believed that these might have influenced the local elections. Now, as always, whenever the Democrats lose in our state, they freak out, they lash out, and they pretty much go crazy. So within a few weeks, I was in multiple lawsuits, sued by the Washington State Democratic Party. I was sued by Jay-Z Knight, who's that crazy cult lady, the primary Democrat donor to the Thurston County Democrat Party at the time. She had come after me. This was actually the third lawsuit that she had filed against me by that point in time. And this time, of course, she was using local Democrat followers, including her son, as her pawns in the litigation. And I also had a death threat from a local Democrat PCO, which stands for Precinct Committee Officer, that was made against me. And not exactly the brightest guy in the gang. This Democrat Precinct Committee Officer was named Lorian Weiser, and he called me, leaving this death threat. He called me from his home phone, and he left a voicemail. And just a pro tip out there, if you ever want to get a formal restraining order issued against somebody, it's particularly helpful if you can play the death threat for the judge in court. Just makes it easier. Anyway, in the midst of all this drama, I had also had a few campaign finance complaints filed against me with the Public Disclosure Commission, the PDC. And while the rest of this drama was all fun and games and just part of the local political scene in my state, and despite the fact that it was probably the least important issue at the time, it was actually this PDC complaint against me that had the biggest impact, although certainly not the impact that the Democrats probably intended to at the time. Now, I was reasonably knowledgeable about Washington State's campaign finance laws then. However, I was not nearly as knowledgeable as I thought. I had experienced my fair share of PDC complaints that had been filed against me in the past, silly ones that had no merit and which were casually dismissed when I ran for office in 2010, and legitimate complaints that were filed against me when I was on the school board for failing to file my financial disclosure documents on time. I actually really enjoyed those complaints because I was teaching activists about the process, and I happily went to the hearings, I chatted with PDC staff, and I got to experience the whole process, including getting a minor fine, which I clearly deserved. And under the rules of the time, that was really interesting. So that had happened to me back in 2013 or so. Now, I also think it is important to put the concept of campaign finance laws in the context of free speech, because clearly campaign finance laws exist to restrict free speech. They do. I mean, there's no serious rational argument that can really dispute that fact. However, there are objectives of campaign finance laws that are generally believed to be so important that most people support actually having campaign finance. And these campaign finance laws, regardless of whatever their political theory is, and mostly this is public support for the transparency aspect of knowing exactly who is funding these political campaigns. For example, it's been illegal since most of us have been alive, basically for foreign governments to fund political campaigns in America. And this has always been frowned upon, and for obvious reasons. Most Americans, we don't want foreign countries to control who gets into public office and who runs our country. However, in an effort to kind of enforce these basic transparency goals, both the federal government using the Federal Elections Commission bureaucracy and at the state level, in my state of Washington it's called the Public Disclosure Commission, these agencies and rules, once created, they do tend to grow and metastasize beyond all original recognition. What starts out as a worthy goal, gradually, like all bureaucratic institutions, it bloats into an unrecognizable tool for justifying its own existence. Patchwork rules and laws that are added over time, usually when a political challenger uses a new election strategy that almost works and it scares the status quo incumbents. Most campaign finance laws are written to protect incumbents from challengers. And in this way, campaign finance laws mostly have evolved into incumbency protection laws and rackets. Washington state was no different. Sure, our campaign finance laws were largely a result originally of a popular citizens initiative back in 1972, which introduced a pile of sunshine law requirements across the state, not just campaign finance laws. And they were modified over time by the legislature. Now, one thing had changed in the enforcement of these laws over the years. And it wasn't so much a conspiracy as just the inevitable predicted result of a bureaucracy that just becomes adrift over time, and the growth of more rules and regulations that tend to sprout on the original legal concept like barnacles on an abandoned ship in Puget Sound. Nobody was really paying that much attention. And the original idea was that all elections were adversarial activities, and the respective opponents would hold the other guy accountable by tracking their opponents and then filing complaints against them, and then if they didn't follow the law. And the theory existed that the media would use the PDC resources to expose violations and problems that the general public might fail to uncover. It was a reasonable theory. At least in practice, however, the campaign finance laws of Washington state were weaponized almost exclusively by the political staff of the state attorney general's office and aggressive county prosecuting attorneys in some cases, left-leaning media, and the Democratic Party, which had great influence inside the bureaucracy. Now, to be fair, the Republicans were at fault here too, because over the past 20 years or so, they had become convinced that the PDC and the laws were weaponized against them, and they essentially stopped trying to hold their political opponents accountable. They mostly gave up and tried to comply and survive the inevitable complaints that were sent their way. Now, this laziness or kind of listlessness of the Republicans largely opened the door to many of the Democrat Party groups essentially stopping even pretending to follow the law, with few, if any, consequences. Wholesale law breaking was common on the Democratic Party side of things, and nobody noticed, or they were too apathetic to care. I mean, here's just some examples of the contrast. Tim Eyman, a local initiative sponsor who typically championed initiatives to there is no greater sin, was and continues to be irrationally scorched earth by Bob Ferguson, the Washington State Attorney General's person, who he's the Attorney General and he's been there for a while, and ever since 2012 complaints, he's been enforcing these campaign violations through this massive litigation process that on the same issues that have been committed by Democrat groups in the state. But the Democrat or left-leaning groups usually only get wrist slaps or minor fines. Eyman gets a decade-long legal torture program with $5.2 million of fines and harassment that has never been equaled by any other legal action conducted by the AG in the history of the state. And while there is a fig leaf pretense of claiming to enforce the law equally towards all, in practice this isn't even close to reality. If you're on the wrong political team, the laws were enforced, and oftentimes they still are, but they were very, very differently. And that's a problem. So here's what essentially inspired me and kind of launched this Don Quixote-like effort to expose the truth and then hold our political class more accountable. And first, as I mentioned, I had a PDC complaint filed against me in the midst of all the drama, death threats, and lawsuits. Secondly, the Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, was in the process of using a very minor infraction of the campaign finance laws, kind of in coordination with some lefty groups, to try to bring down Republican Secretary of State Kim Wyman, right at the same time by doing multiple press conferences and imposing a pretty significant fine, conveniently right in the middle of an election year. Finally, and I hope I don't come across as a passive guy in this process, I started filing PDC complaints right back at the politicians who were attacking me in the papers at the time. I mean, essentially, the newspapers would quote some local politician who was attacking me for daring to engage in the political process, and I'd look up that politician's campaign documents, figure out the laws that they broke, and then I'd file complaints right back at them. And one of these politicians was local state Senator Sam Hunt, who is a local Democrat politician. He's been fossilized in political office for decades now. And my first complaint inspired him to draft a letter to the PDC, which stated essentially, Glen Morgan doesn't know anything about our state's campaign finance laws, which inspired me actually to reread all these laws again. And I realized he was right. I hadn't known the laws as well as I thought I did. However, now I memorized them and I started to research, and I suddenly realized that nearly everyone was breaking these laws and nobody was holding them accountable. So by early 2017, I'd filed hundreds of campaign finance complaints against everyone on the dominant political power side of the spectrum, mostly Democrats, progressives, and others. And this was a larger volume of complaints than the PDC had ever received, even within the previous half-decade. I mean, it took me about 30 complaints or so before I was able to start getting the systematic about how my processes worked and more effective in the type of complaints that I was filing. But by this time, of course, it was obvious to me that the law was screwed up. But I felt that the only way to change that law was to enforce it rigorously, to paraphrase an old Abraham Lincoln statement. And I would do complaint request nights on Facebook, for example, and report with live blogging about the complaints I was filing and then post them for everyone to see. My personal record in one night was 35, and I think I didn't get to sleep till about 3 in the morning, but it was good fun. I just really got into it. I was doing quite a bit of it. And the executive director of the PDC actually quit. The staff of the PDC were completely overwhelmed, and they couldn't even process the complaints. The media was complaining, like this Seattle Times article, and the Democrat Party, of course, was just foaming at the mouth, just losing itself, really. And one aspect of the law at the time that was particularly effective was something called the citizen action notice process. And it was really a concept that had mostly existed in the environmental side of government regulations. And the theory was that a citizen needed the option to initiate formal litigation against a defendant if the state refused to do their job and then do it themselves. And the left was very good at using this legal procedure in many areas. Mostly it had started on the environmental side of things, but most famously in their sue and settle complaints like with the over Endangered Species Act issues with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. But they had also used it effectively on the campaign finance side of things in the past by triggering lawsuits against Tim Wyman, Washington State Republicans, Kim Wyman's Republican Secretary of State, the building industry of Washington, BIW, and others. And as part of the citizen action notice process, it triggers a fuse with a very hard timeline for the AG to file a lawsuit against the defendant before the plaintiff, who's the guy like me who was filing the complaint, must do so instead. So if the AG fails to do that, then the plaintiff, in this case me, can file the lawsuit instead, and then the state must cover the legal costs. Now, this had obviously been used to great effect by others to abuse the process in the past, so I started to use it myself. And I filed hundreds of these as well, hundreds. And the state AG was then forced to get ahead of the filings, and in order to protect his political friends, he needed to file AG lawsuits instead on these politicians or these PACs. And now I forced his office to file 19 of these lawsuits over just a few months before one of his lead attorneys in that department actually quit. And he said he didn't go to work for the AG's office to sue Democrats, presumably meaning that he'd only planned to sue Republicans while he was there. And this essentially crashed the AG's office, and they no longer had the resources to handle the volume of complaints I was filing. That was pretty amazing, actually. So this meant I had to start filing these lawsuits myself. And I had to recruit a handful of attorneys from around the state, and I started to file these lawsuits against a wide variety of groups. The NEA, various union PACs, Pierce County Superior Court judge, some Democratic Party groups around the state, etc. And I've listed all these cases, and I've linked to the settlement documents down below, just in case you think I'm exaggerating or lying. It's all there. It's easy to find. It's a very public record. And you can see for yourself all of the legal drama and the chaos that ensued at that time. And there are several key stories which illustrate the chaos at the time. And they pop out to me upon reflection of that time period, and they're really worth relating. Now, first, I had been collecting data from a variety of disaffected Democrats in various groups around the state. In fact, these were key for some of these complaints. And some of them had access to inside information, which helped me file more effective complaints. And sometimes I couldn't file the actual source documents themselves because it might expose my sources directly. And in one case, however, I had triggered the AG's office to file a lawsuit against Spokane County Democrats, and I had access to bank statements that indicated that they might be trying to deceive the AG's office and conceal funds in different accounts. And since the AG has subpoena power, I wanted to meet with their attorneys, show them the source documents that I had so that all were aware of the actual account numbers, and then it would help with their investigation. In that meeting, which happened in the lobby of the AG's office in Olympia, one of the AG attorneys was super aggressive with me, and he was really trying to identify my source inside the Democratic Party. He was actually demanding that I tell him this, and I refused to tell him, and he got angry and very bitter about it, and he didn't even care that they broke the law. In theory, that's the law he's trying to enforce, and that they were potentially trying to conceal more information. He didn't care about that. He only cared about the whistleblower, presumably so that he could out them to the Democrats in Spokane. And it was very unprofessional and kind of hyper-partisan experience, and it didn't surprise me that he quit a few weeks later. And he tried to set up a legal business defending the Democrat organizations around the state from these very types of complaints that, in theory, he'd been prosecuting. Yes, he was that one who publicly stated that he didn't go to the work at the AG's office to prosecute Democrats, presumably only Republicans. And my actions ruined his career expectations and experience, apparently. Now, in truth, since I forced the AG to reluctantly file lawsuits against his political allies, he did everything in his power to downgrade the penalties, reduce the costs, and protect his friends. For example, Bob Ferguson created a payment plan system, starting with the Pierce County Democrats, and then applying this to most of the other Democrat groups at the time, and that I had forced him to sue. Until that point in time, it had always been the custom of the AG's office to demand payment absolutely in full within 30 days of the final settlement, or else they'd be in big trouble. But that wasn't so fun when you're forced to sue your friend. So he, of course, went soft, creating payment plans spread over many years, downplayed the attorney fees, and really reduced the costs so that the total penalties would be a lot smaller. And he used plenty of other softball actions that had never been displayed, never once in the history of the AG's office, and certainly never when he went after a Republican group before that. It was also interesting to note how the PDC's former leadership colluded to assist various Democrat organizations in addressing their legal problems. The former PDC executive director became the free legal counsel to the Pierce County Democrats, for example. And a former PDC board member formally helped the Spokane County Democrats negotiate out of their problems. I never saw anything like that type of insider assistance to Republican groups. A variety of Democrat organizations were allowed to disband and even run away rather than face any legal penalties, something that has never been allowed before, certainly to any Republican group in state history. This included groups like the Pacific County Democrats and the Island County Democrats, among others. And I've listed again all these groups in the website link below with their respective source documents. Another weird experience that happened to me at the time was a leader in the Democratic Party wanted to meet with me. And since I frequently meet with a lot of Democrats around the state, I took the meeting, and in a friendly way, he threatened that if I kept filing complaints against Democrat or progressive groups in the state, that the Democrats would file hundreds of complaints against Republicans. And I suspect this threat was perceived by someone as likely to get me to stop. However, since my goal was to reform the law, I informed them that they didn't need my permission to do that. If they filed their complaints, it would only help me get to the reforms that I wanted a lot quicker. Now, in the end, they eventually started to file the complaints against Republicans, but this just grew until the legislative session of 2018 rolled around, and the panic in Olympia was palpable. Until that year, the only people who ever wanted to reform the campaign finance laws in the state were the occasional Republicans who just got accused of wanting to destroy transparency, and they would usually only try that once. Or it was incumbents trying to make the rules harder to follow. And suddenly now, in 2018, there was a bipartisan desire to reform the statute, and everyone was in a hurry and a panic. The Republicans hardly knew how to negotiate the proposed changes because the Democrats are tripping over themselves to get to a resolution. Now, keep in mind, in 2018, the balance of power was much closer than it is now. The bill became known as the Stop Glen Morgan Bill. That's actually what they called it, the nickname behind the scene. That wasn't the title they put on the bill. But, and the funny thing is, I actually supported many of the changes proposed in the statute. Not all of them, but many of them. And many were just common sense, and none of them would have changed if I didn't force the political powers that be to experience the true joys and wonder of the campaign finance laws that they had written and expected others to follow. Now, a weird side note at the time, Washington state law does not allow a legislator to vote on a piece of legislation that directly and personally benefits them. Because I had so many pending cases against a majority of elected officials in both the House and the Senate, the Speaker of the House had to formally indicate that this law would be suspended, because if they strictly interpreted the law in this manner, there would not be a lawful quorum in the legislature. I had literally gotten so many people in trouble, and those cases were still pending. So that meant that it was theoretically possible for me to formally prevent the legislature from ever enacting reform on this law in the future just by filing lots of complaints like I'd done. So this was obviously an absurd outcome, and they overruled that the law in this case should be applied, and they wanted to pass the Stop Glen Morgan bill desperately, so it was just funny. It's never happened in the history of the state before, but they did in this case. So Governor Inslee, of course, signed the bill. I mean, of course he did. I had a pending complaint against him and his buddy Bob Ferguson at the same time, so they couldn't get the pen to paper fast enough. However, all was not done yet, and I had a deadline by which I could still activate my final citizen action notice lawsuits that had kind of been piling up at this point in time, which I had earned standing when the AG refused to act any longer. And I scrambled to find enough attorneys, and I got my lawsuits filed before the deadline ran out. There were dozens of them, and some of those cases were quickly settled. But the Superior Court, judges in Thurston County, and the justices at the Supreme Court decided that, counter to all previous decisions on these cases for decades, that they needed to protect the unions and the Democrats, most importantly. And so they changed the historic ruling, and eventually, after many years in court, and they finally eliminated the last citizen action notice cases that were still outstanding last year. I think I had about 8 of them still in court. Now, I still file complaints against politicians. They still break the law, even after the reforms. There's far less teeth in these laws today, of course, so I expect the law breaking to actually increase in the future as insiders realize that there's no impactful penalties that will ever be imposed against them. And this is particularly true if they're on the right political team. That's very important. However, at the same time, it is much more difficult to weaponize the process against just one side of the political spectrum, as it had been in the past before I kind of went down this road. Now, I tell the story not to promote myself. I don't really matter other than being the guy who happened to be caught up in the drama at the time. Sure, I do track the results still on my website. You can see them down below. But that's just to ensure the historical record is kept, and because it makes it easier for me to reference what actually happened, as the bureaucracy and the traditional media like to memory hold these things. I plan to keep paying attention to the politicians and the bureaucrats who do so much damage to our communities and our state. That won't change. And I hope to train others to do the same. And I feel that some successes with those efforts could help inspire people whenever they want to get involved. However, the real story here, I believe, is that you can make a difference if you're willing to engage. You can have an impact if you're willing to look at things differently. I can't tell you how many people, how many people who many would perceive as like being on the same political team as me came up to me and begged me to stop right in the middle of this whole process. Some of them were good people. They meant well. And I was impressed with how many people cowered in fear, afraid to even talk about these issues, running away. Once a negative article came out about me, right, they were fearful. They'd run to the other side of the room. However, despite mistakes and lessons and the inevitable drama that always comes with it, you can absolutely inflict change on the system. It isn't easy. You got to force it. It is also sometimes requires you to do things people have never tried before. It is certainly risky. You will get flack, absolutely. Remember, if you care about liberty and freedom, you are the greatest threat to big government and their big plans that exist. Sometimes you just have to innovate and do something different. Also, I'll point out that it would have been impossible for me to do this entirely alone. Many people helped me collect the data. Some who were close to me and very public about their help, and many others who wished to remain in the shadows, particularly those Democrats who had inside information. And the lesson there is that you must be capable and willing to work with others. Everything is a team. Sure, I'm the one that got the death threats, the nasty articles, and all the lawsuits. However, you can't do anything alone, and you will be far more successful with a team of people who you are willing to protect, help, and work with in whatever way they can help for the common goal. You also can't predict the future. You may not succeed. Other doors may open for you that you don't expect. But I do plan on try to keep holding those in power accountable in our state. And I'll keep exposing the truth when I can and as best I'm able to. And I encourage you to do the same. Because remember, whatever happens, the future will only belong to those who show up, and certainly those who engage. Nobody else will matter. And you want to be the person to show up, and perhaps we can report on your story in the near future. Now, I know this was a long video. I hope you appreciate the stories and you found it worthwhile and educational. Thank you so much for watching. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe down below. You never know who else might, who you might know actually, who might be inspired to show up and do far more impactful things if they watch a video like this in the future. Thank you very much.